I'm going to be characterizing very briefly the three different types of modeling that AnyLogic supports, and then we'll go on to look at hybrid models that weave together these three types of modeling. I will be, per discussion, I will not be covering in detail the trade-offs or features of a situation which would recommend the use of one approach versus another in a certain areas of a model. For that, I would delegate to my talk from University of New South Wales boot camp in February 2013. Just to orient people, there are a variety of system science approaches applied in health. 4 of them are listed here, which are particularly popular and which our group has used substantially. So system dynamics, agent-based modeling, social network analysis, and discrete event modeling. Social network analysis can be conducted in a dynamic way, but in a lot of cases it's conducted in a static fashion. Very powerful for insights concerning the impact of social network structure and context on people's health evolution, but I'm not going to be covering that here. That's something I view as outside this context because we're focusing on dynamic modeling here. We're going to be focusing on these other 3 approaches, system dynamics, agent-based modeling, and discrete event modeling. So system dynamics as an approach, I would characterize as much a perspective as it is a technique or methodology. There are some people who would argue that it's a field unto itself, although I happen to differ with them. But it's an perspective of viewing the world that has been emphasized over the years by a sizable literature. And coming along with that perspective is a methodology that's designed to help conceptualize, describe, so how to think about, characterize, so specify, in a descriptive sense, analyze and critically manage feedback systems. It originated in the 1950s with Jay Forrester at MIT in the engineering field. He later moved, shortly thereafter, moved over to Sloan School of Management at MIT, where he pursued what he called industrial dynamics. And so from the very start, it was focused on management of complex systems, where if we try to do it by the seat of the pants, we're likely to see blowback effects, policy resistance, cases where we're working at cross purposes with the nature of things, with the nature of the system, and we end up having effects that fall far short of what we're seeking, or that are actually contrary to what we're trying to achieve. And much of system dynamics as a field focuses very strongly on the issue of shifting people's mental models. This is a very important point. When modelers try to compare different modeling approaches, a lot of the things that they get caught up in and focus on are the details of the formalisms, how you describe the model, the particular mechanisms, the elements of the vocabulary. Those are the sort of hard technical things that it's easy to get distracted by. So we'll build a model in system dynamics as an aggregate model and agent-based modeling. We'll say, look how different these are from each other. And there's things to learn from that. And I've done quite a bit of that in my time. But I think the more fundamental difference between these methodologies is often the questions they're trying to ask, what they're trying to achieve. And in system dynamics, a major emphasis in model after model after model is trying to shift how people think about a system. By contrast, in agent-based modeling, traditionally there's been more of an emphasis on getting out a model that is helpful, predictive, insightful. It's the modeling artifact more than the modeling process that's emphasized in agent-based modeling. And in system dynamics, the attention is on mental models, shifting how people conceptualize the system. And as a result, it tends to focus on models that are more easily accessible, that are simpler, and that capture common misunderstandings about a system, rather than models that are highly predictive, but complex. Now, there's a big spectrum within system dynamics. It's just that this is a recurrent issue, shifting mental models. It's rare you meet a system dynamics modeler who says that's not one of their goals. In my opinion, it's rare you meet an agent-based modeler who, if you list their top goals of modeling, say that's a major goal of theirs. And that's a big distinction sociologically and sort of in terms of what people are trying to achieve. I've met agent-based modelers, very prominent people in the North American landscape in agent-based modeling, who say they're totally uninterested in changing mental models. It's just not on their radar. It's not their point of interest. They're interested in giving good recommendations in more of a technocratic sense. And there's no inherent reason it has to be so. It's just these are the different mores of the field. Now, system dynamics tends to focus on features of a system that fundamentally managing it effectively, understanding those features. And the primary two attributes are feedbacks, these cases where a given change in the system, say the introduction of an infection from the Raleigh-Durham airport into this area leads to a cascading series of changes that either amplify that original change, say the spread of infection, that person comes in contact with susceptibles, leads to more people being infected, it leads to a larger number of people circulating with infection, even more people getting infected, and you get one of these vicious cycles, or the changes push back against that original change. Think about you grow hungry, you go get something to eat, and the hunger decreases. These are examples of reinforcing and balancing feedback. And secondly, it emphasizes accumulations, cases where things accumulate over time, and accumulations as a cause for inertia, delay, and disequilibrium, cases where a system's not in balance, and it takes a while for it to be in equilibrium. And system dynamics is a really big attention to cognitive limits, how we think about complex systems and how that leaves us vulnerable to kind of mistakes in reasoning about them, and a very large emphasis on stakeholder participation in modeling. You're trying to shift how people think about a situation, so you tend to weave them into the modeling process. Finally, and another big emphasis, the system dynamics models admit to formal reasoning and analysis. You could take a model from system dynamics and you can reason about it. And among other things, that can allow us to take a causal loop diagram like this, turn it into a quantitative stock and flow model. Stocks highlighted here, these are the accumulations, flows as sort of these transitions between the accumulations with a certain number of people per unit time between them. These are the sort of the elements of the modeling vocabulary of system dynamics. You can see how much smaller it is than the agent-based modeling methodology, but by putting them together, you can get intriguing behavior, putting them together in creative ways. And because of system dynamics models being able to be analyzed, things like take a causal loop diagram and highlight certain feedbacks that are currently driving the system. So early on, perhaps it will be this new infections, the new infections, contact with development of latently infected individuals getting out of latency, becoming infective, causing new and associated with new contacts and transmission of new infections. Maybe that's the dominant loop initially, and then later it's this loop that limits the number of contacts because of depletion of susceptibles. Those may be elements of shifting loop dominance, and they can be highlighted mathematically on the basis of mathematical calculations based on the underlying differential equations. These sort of models have a representation that consists of ordinary differential equations that can be analyzed, and you can reason about the behavior of smaller systems like this in a very powerful general way by reasoning about all possible behaviors of the system, regardless of, for the wide ranges of parameter values allowed, how could the system possibly behave? And you can identify equilibria, cases where the system will be in balance. Some equilibrium might be a disease-free equilibrium. It's unstable, and you can identify that. One infective coming in can lead to an outbreak, and some may be stable, cases of a endemic equilibrium. situation where there's some bug in the population, but it's not, there's no outbreak occurring. It's in kind of stasis. So within system dynamics, we can reason about these things. I don't have time to go into this, but suffice it to say that flows here dictate changes in stocks over time. Stocks summarize the current state of the system completely. And so flows dictate changes in stocks. You write the formulas for flows, and you just determined by its flows. And then the stocks determine the values of the flows for the next little period. Stocks are the state of the system. They're the current situation in the system. And we count the number of people, say, who are susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered, and that's the current state of the system. There's no individuation. There's no recognition of individuals. There's no real ability in general to ask the question, of these people who are infective now, how many were infective, 100 days ago? How many have gotten infected more than 10 times? That's not really something we can ask in the context of system dynamics in general. Those sorts of questions about individuals and their trajectories. And meanwhile, and similarly, we can't really ask how effective would an intervention be if it differentially treated people who have had 3 or more past infections. That's not something we can investigate easily because we can't get access to individual trajectories to their history. Okay? So within system dynamics, we're dealing with cross-sectional depictions of a population state over time. Very powerful and very effective for changing people's mental models. So I've just given a bit of a glimpse of system dynamics. Do you want me to say anything more about that? Is that on the order we're looking for? Just for its richness. It's an incredibly interesting and rich area. I've just touched on a couple of highlights that I think are distinctive in the modeling space. Any questions? Okay. So agent-based modeling we've talked about. I don't think I need to talk a lot about that. That's been the focus of the boot camp, so I'm not going to speak about that. Terrific. Much more here. We have one or more populations of agents, each represented at an individual level. These agents are each associated with some state, some current situation and characteristics. They evolve over time according to some sort of rules in any logic, much of it declaratively specified. The agents interact with one another and more broadly with the surrounding context through this environment captured by either networks or spatial context, for example. And we have the capacity to delineate multi-level structures by having different sort of hierarchy of agents. Many other features that I could cite, but those are some of the essential aspects I've emphasized, okay? Discrete event modeling, I think many of you in the room have applied this as much or more as I have. It's a tool in our toolbox, one we haven't tended to lean on as a central tool. It tends in its traditional form to be associated by articulation of workflows. We have entities which, particularly in earlier days, tended to be more passive, flowing through a set of processes over time, depicted by things we might informally call workflows. Those entities are operated on according to the availability of resources, which are often capacitated, often constrained by availability. So a given entity within the system may be waiting for some period of time in a queue because of lack of availability of a resource. Think about the availability of an X-ray machine or another piece of diagnostic equipment like an ultrasound scanner, or think about availability of a surgeon for availability of resources, and they interact with each other predominantly, those entities, through availability of resources. They're not typically interacting by spreading infection or sending each other messages so much as keeping each other waiting. There's a set of processes operating on the individuals as they flow through, and we have these sort of flow charts or these workflow diagrams that depict their evolution, and these resource pools that are often specified in a sort of interchangeable fashion. So we have a set of clinicians that can operate on people, and the question is how many of them there are, not their individual characteristics. Agent-based modeling or discrete event modeling is extremely powerful for representing processing in the context of limited resources, and particularly in the health sphere, identify impacts of health service delivery and understanding throughput or waiting times associated with health service delivery. So the impact of level of resources on throughput, on how many agents we can treat, the quality or the speediness of care, for identifying issues with resource coordination, placement of resources in space. This is not something I've identified, but in AnyLogic and other packages, you can situate resources at certain locations, and it takes time to go and retrieve those resources and bring them to a place where they can be used. And so if you need to how long it takes to get a resource in terms of the quality or the timeliness of care offered, say within a triage unit, you can examine that quite readily in discrete event modeling packages by placing that resource at different locations and seeing its impact on speediness of quality of care conferred. You know, I would say as a general principle, compared to agent-based modeling, I find discrete event modeling is more accessible to a lot of people. Like system dynamics, it doesn't require quite as much in the way of programming. There is some often associated with use of tools like Arena and AnyLogic as well, but it's somewhat less demanding than agent-based modeling is in terms of the amount of code that you'll be performing. For traditional packages, for repath programming, for discrete event modeling packages, it hasn't been as limiting a resource constraint when it comes to use of this sort of modeling type. So discrete event modeling, you know, we've used quite extensively to look at issues of resource availability and their impact on care. Okay, I have slides on sort of benefits, motivations for different type of modeling that we've used in our decision making. I'm not going to present this here, but you'll find me talk through these slides online, and I can leave that there. I probably haven't done service to some of, well, I know I haven't done service to some of these types of methods in my comments. Are there any others from the audience that would like to chime in about features that you think should be could be additionally brought out for those in the audience about each of these types of modeling? I've taken an extreme